So one of my areas of interest is the history of sexually marginalized women in Toronto and urban landscapes generally. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about something that we can't see and that you have to walk a little bit even to see where it used to be. So if you walked along Dundas until Elizabeth, you would be at the site of what was called the Continental Hotel. The Continental Hotel was the watering hole and workplace for working class lesbians and sex workers in Toronto in the 1950s, particularly the early part of the 1950s before heroin hit the streets here. Women came to Toronto for jobs during World War II, and we have some graphic of some steel workers at the end of the war trying to make sure they can keep their jobs, and they didn't, but we'll get to that. They came to Toronto during World War II for jobs, particularly factory jobs. So Inglis, a Toronto appliance manufacturer that was retooled to make munitions and planes, etc., had 9,000 women working there in 1944. This gave women an opportunity to meet each other, and some of them paired up. There was a small hidden gay scene in Toronto during the war. It was mostly for women accompanying gay men to gay men's parties and hanging out with each other. After 1950, the factory jobs, which were the best paid work in town for women, dried up. And by 1961, there were only 50 women left working at Inglis. Women of color, Asian and black women, women of color, particularly Asian and black women, had always, even during the peak years of the war, had difficulty accessing the good jobs. They were kept out of the best paid factory work. The 1950s also saw a cultural redefinition of femininity. So during the war, we were supposed to be tough, capable war workers, but in the 1950s we were supposed to become housewives and consumers. In the reframing of femininity to make women over into housewives and consumers, butch or masculine women got the short end of the stick. They got framed as freaks and as inappropriate because they wouldn't buy into the sort of ideals about femininity of the time. As a consequence, these women couldn't get jobs that were available to most women. So jobs like secretary, retail clerks, servers, etc. required feminine deportment. So butch lesbians found limited jobs, driving cabs in a baby carriage factory around King and Dufferin, as auto mechanics, bowling pin setters, car jockeys for car rental companies, hand bill deliverers, and couriers. Since the jobs that allowed them to wear pants and shirts and ducktails in their hair were so rare, they tended to hang on to them for dear life, and when one became available, they told each other about them so that other butches could get jobs. There were few of these jobs, however, so a lot of masculine women had to turn to the street economy of drugs, sex work, and petty theft. In the early 1950s, Ontario's liquor license laws still required public bars, or in this case of the Continental, it was called a beer hall, to provide at least 2 physically separate rooms. They were worried that ladies would be negatively influenced by the ways that men behaved when they were drunk. So what this did for a lot of folks was make a space that sex workers could work out of, right? So men were only allowed in the ladies and escorts room if they were accompanied by a woman. So men who were interested in hiring one of the sex workers who plied their trade out of the Continental Hotel had to enter with a woman. So the butch women would hang around out front and they'd cut deals with these guys, right? They would say, you know, I'll take you in, because they needed a woman to get in, and I'll even help you find the girl of your dreams for the evening if you buy me and my buddy Mo here our drinks for the night, okay? So the heterosexual interest of these men was used by the women for financial gain and basically survival. Both the butches and the femmes turned tricks, and sometimes they rolled or picked the pockets of these Johns. They were pretty safe in the knowledge that if the Johns figured it out and tried to come after them in the bars that they hung out in, that the staff would eject the guys rather than the lesbians who were their regular clientele. It's not an accident that the Continental Hotel was in the Chinatown of the time. Y'all know that where Nathan Phillips Square is now used to be Chinatown. It's a very interesting story, but beside this. Chinatown was socially and economically isolated from the rest of Toronto because of racism, so it offered a shelter from the more respectable citizens of the rest of Toronto, and it lacked both organized crime and pimps. Because of the racist immigration laws that Jennifer talked about, in 1951 there were only 194 Chinese women in Toronto to 1,758 Chinese men. Because of this sex ratio imbalance, and because of attitudes towards sexuality that weren't grounded in the Judeo-Christian traditions of shame around the body in the same ways, Chinatown had a well-established sex trade. Wealthy Chinese men were known to enter into a variety of forms of exchange with sex-working women, often lesbians, that ranged from being the sex worker's regular client to keeping the woman and sometimes even marrying and raising family. So the other picture that I have is this story that I've told you today is the beginning of a history of solidarity between marginalized women in Toronto. That's uneven, of course, but the other picture that we have is of a demo. I think it's from the 60s. I had a little trouble dating the photo, that clearly frames sex workers' rights as in the same camp as the rights of lesbian or gay women. So,
I don't have this photo.
Oh, I have it. So those are banners. Maureen has it back there too. Okay, so now we're going to Spadina and Richmond. Queen and Spadina.
Looking at here is actually behind the streetcar right now. So that brick building on the corner there used to hold a number of union offices. The upper floors of the building, so right above the Hero Burgers, which I'm not sure is unionized, gonna guess no, in the 1930s held the United Shoe Workers of America, the United Garment Workers, the Brotherhood of Painters and Decorators, the office of an Italian newspaper, and please excuse me on this, I am not Italian, Lavo degli Italo Canadese, maybe. I will pass it around or spell it phonetically. And it also held the office of the Workers' Unity League. Now, the Workers' Unity League is kind of the more important one in this sense because it was organized by the Communist Party during the 1930s as a left breakaway from the American Federation of Labor, otherwise known as the AFL. And it was an aggressive militant organization bent not only on organizing unorganized workers, but also on organizing the unemployed, which is something that sort of dropped off our radar. In the face of incredible odds and dangers, this group did most of the worker organizing during the Depression years in order to strengthen industrial unions and replace craft unions with unions that are open to all, not just the highly skilled workers. The WUL didn't just focus on white men in skilled trades, as the industrial unions tended to, but looked for a broader base among all workers, including women and including workers of color. The WUL also experienced state-level attacks on their members, on their workers, and on the organization itself. They were closed, however, in 1935 by the Communist Party leadership, who advised its members to go back to the AFL and work from within that central union structure. And what we're going to hear about next is two women organizers in the WUL who based their work in Toronto but also traveled around Canada to support workers' struggles. So I think it's Sue's up first.
We should have a nice doorstep everywhere we go. I'm going to talk to you about Annie Buller. And sorry.
Yeah. Is that better?
Yeah.
Okay. So here's Annie Buller. I'll pass her around. And two photos of Annie and Estevan. And we'll talk about that in a sec. So Annie Buller was born in the Ukraine and came to Montreal with her parents in the early 1900s. She became politically active in socialist politics during World War I and studied Marxist thought at the Rand School of Social Science in New York. So right from the beginning, there was no doubt of which direction she was heading in, clearly in the left. With two other women, Becky Bouhet and Bella Gold, several others, Buller came back to Montreal and founded the Montreal Labour College. In the 1920s, she worked as a union organizer, again with the Workers' Unity League, and traveled extensively throughout Canada, organizing in the needle trades and supporting miners and steel workers. In 1931, while serving on the executive board of the communist-led Industrial Needleworkers Union, she helped lead a general strike for better wages and working conditions for dressmakers. And later in 1931, Annie joined the Estevan, Saskatchewan miners on a month-long strike. And this is one of the neatest stories. The Estevan riot, or also known as the Black Tuesday riot, was a confrontation between the RCMP and striking coal miners. The coal miners were from Benfet, Saskatchewan, and several hundred of them assembled on the streets of Estevan with their families to parade through the streets and draw attention to their strike. The RCMP confronted them, attempted to block their way and break up the procession. There was violence. Police opened fire on the strikers and killed 3 of them. Many others were wounded and arrested. The riot remains a controversial event to this day in Estevan. 3 striking miners who were killed and had the inscription on their gravestone, "Murdered by the RCMP." And to this day, 83 years later, people from the community come and erase that message, and another group comes along and puts it back again on their headstone. So the history has not been forgotten. As a result of her action in Estevan, Buller was arrested and convicted of inciting a riot, appealed, and was jailed for a year in North Battleford. Then she went on to organize the On to Ottawa Trek, and during a crackdown of Communist Party members in World War II, she was again arrested and jailed in Portage-la-Prairie from 1940 to 1942. Her husband, Harry Goralnik, was also interned. She ran for public office several times as a city councillor in Toronto in 1932, and again in 52 in St. Paul's riding, and here in Spadina in 57. After World War II, Annie continued to be involved in Communist Party activities and was the managing editor of the party's paper, The Tribune. She organized campaigns to roll back prices with the National Women's Commission and the Housewives Association, traveled to the USSR, and remained politically active until her death in 1973. Maureen.
Okay. So I'm going to talk about another woman who was with the Workers' Unity League. Her name was Lili Ilomäki, and she was a Finnish member of the Workers' Unity League. The thing that's important to remember about this era of the Depression up and down Spadina was that, particularly women, but everybody working on Spadina, there were such minimal laws that protected them. I was reading last night that there was a minimum wage law, but the employers were required, at least in the garment industry, to only give minimum wage to 60% of its employees. So, it wasn't a real minimum wage. And then, as now, there was no investment by the government, or very little investment by the government, into enforcing the Employment Standards Act. So it was really, really heroic work that these people were doing, and they were actually under attack quite a bit of the time. But in the wonderful book on Spadina by Rosemary Donegan, with tons of photos, she has an excerpt, a quote from Lily Ilimaki, and we like to include this on our walking tours. We moved to the Spadina area when I was 2 or 3 years old, and from then on we lived in 17 different houses between College and Queen on practically every street. We lived so close to Spadina because my father was an underpresser, a cloak maker. Don't you love that word? Cloak maker. He used to walk to work and come home for lunch. My mother always worked. As a matter of fact, I think I was one of the first kids to attend daycare nursery at St. Christopher's House during the First World War when they were set up. I started working in, wait for it, hosiery repair in 1929 when I was 16 years old. We repaired silk hosiery with runs and invisible mending. They had the recycling thing right, eh? We got the minimum wage of $12 a week, which was considered pretty good. $12 a week in 1929. I became a field organizer for the Young Communist League in 1931. I was organizing through Southwest Ontario, the automobile workers. Then I was down through the Niagara Peninsula organizing either through the Workers' Unity League or the CIO, the Congress of Industrial Organizations, the industrial unions. I was involved in picket lines and organizing the unemployed. You stayed in people's homes and you got your food, but you didn't get paid. I saw my life's work then as a professional revolutionary. For 3 or 4 years, I was an agitator. I spoke on street corners at public meetings. I went on the Great Ottawa Trek in 1935. I was first arrested at the American consulate a few days before Sacco and Vanzetti were killed. Do people know Sacco and Vanzetti? Yeah, and the two workers in Massachusetts who were executed after the robbery and slaying of a payroll officer. They were both truly wrongfully convicted and wrongfully executed, and the state of Massachusetts much later and too late apologized for that, and they were also a cause for Emma Goldman. Anyway, she was first arrested at the American consulate a few days before Sacco and Vanzetti were killed. I was charged with obstruction. I must have been arrested 10 times between 1928 and 1934 for street meetings, picket lines, demonstrations in the free speech campaign. I'll never forget the names of the Red Squad. This is of the police. Mann, Simpson, Mulholland, and Nursey, the chief. When you were arrested, you were rarely charged. They just wanted to intimidate you and take you into the police station. A tactic that may sound familiar to you from the G20 experience. So, after 1934, I was back in Toronto learning a trade as a machine operator on skirts. I realized I had to learn a trade to make a living. Then, when the war came, I went to work on men's uniforms. There are some people here today who knew Lily, and they were telling me on our walk down here that she was a very small person. So, anyway, we'd like to salute the spirit of working women like that and organizers. So I think we're moving on down to the thimble? Yes. Okay.
So now we're standing in front of a piece of public art commissioned by the city. If you look right there, it's a giant bronze thimble and 2 concrete buttons, the one of which I'm standing on and the other one is behind there. Everyone see that, right? So this was one of 8 public art pieces selected by a City of Toronto jury to complement the reopening of the Spadina streetcar in 1997. It's obviously intended to recognize the history and the contribution of the garment industry, and as the artist says, it's to recognize the hands of the women who worked in it and the presence of touch in their work. Passer-buyers often assume that this measuring tape along the side there, and it's quite faded on that side of Spadina, that it was part of the sculpture, but it was added in later on by a local artist called Victor Fraser without the sanction of the artist or the city. As guerrilla art, that's right. As Winnie Ng, the Sam Giddens Chair in Social Justice and Democracy in Ryerson University, and the former organizer for the International Ladies Garment Workers Union, says of the sculpture, it was installed at the same time as the demise of the garment industry and the disappearance of stable, well-paid union factory jobs with the closure of garment factory after garment factory. That's with like NAFTA, right? When the factory jobs disappeared, initially the work went to contractors or home workers, but however in 1998, with the threat of the Free Trade Act of the Americas, the Canadian garment industry was deemed a sunset industry, too high risk, and the workers became its sacrificial lambs. So this area has since been named from the garment industry to the fashion industry district. Notice that. It notes the change in terminology from garment to fashion. Gone are the days when the garment industry was this city's second largest industry, and now the fashion industry provides incubators for young, up-and-coming fashion designers, which is important, of course, but a lot of their sewing work is now done in contracted shops or by home sewers or most often offshores. And that's, yeah,
Okay, I don't want to get tangled up in the tree. So the other person to think about while we're standing here, and it's looking down Spadina a bit further to the McGregor Socks Factory, is Madeleine Perron. Yeah, people have heard of Madeleine Perron. Excellent. Madeleine Perron was born in Montreal in 1918 to an upper middle class family. Rick Salutin, a columnist for the Globe and Mail, once referred to her as one of the finest labor organizers in Canada's history. There's pictures of her circulating from my contemporaries. Some of the things she accomplished in her lifetime: she helped to create the Canadian Textile and Chemical Workers Union, organized women in Ontario, was active in the Fédération des Femmes du Québec, fought for abortion on demand in the 1950s, championed the rights of Aboriginal women, was one of the founders of the Confederation of Canadian Unions, a lifelong labor, feminist, and social justice activist, and she devoted her life to the labor and progressive movements. In 1940, when she graduated from McGill, she went right to work teaching English to French-speaking garment workers in Montreal. And in 1942, she and Leah Roback, a free-thinking communist and activist, organized workers in 6 Montreal Cotton Dominion textile mills in Valleyfield and Montreal. At that time, most of the union leaders felt that the garment workers, or the textile workers, weren't worth organizing because they were primarily women and considered a disorganized group. However, in 1946, strikes broke out at the cotton mills in Valleyfield and Lachute, and these strikes led to the first collective agreement with the International Ladies Garment Workers Union, and more than 6,000 of these textile workers formed a union. So they weren't that disorganized then. Her worst enemies at the time, however, were both the clergy and the government. She was denounced as a heretic by the Roman Catholic Church because of her union activities, as well as a slut and a whore, which I think she would have enjoyed, as I do today. She became the sworn enemy of Quebec Premier Maurice Duplessis, who publicly accused her of being a communist and carried a personal vendetta against her, arresting her more than 5 times. In 1948, he managed to have her arrested and indicted for seditious conspiracy. He rewrote the charges himself to strengthen them, and she was actually convicted. However, it was overturned because the judge got frustrated because there was delay after delay after delay. The trial continued on for more than 7 years. It was the longest trial in Quebec's history. So she was acquitted in 1955 in response to these delays. In 1952, the Quebec textile workers were unfortunately betrayed by their international union, which signed an agreement with Dominion Textile that reflected the concessions that Duplessis wanted. This betrayal made the need for Canadian unions or local unions very clear. Both Perrant and her partner Kent Rowley fought ceaseless battles with their union headquarters, which, like most of them then, were U.S. based. When they were ordered to sign a sellout contract in 1953, they were refused to do so, and so the union expelled them. As a result, Perrant came to Ontario in 1968 with Rowley and started organizing independent Canadian unions, and that was seen as quite a threat to the mainstream labor movement. But they were also very good at organizing younger labor activists and sort of teaching them, mentoring them. So they founded in 1969 the Confederation of Canadian Unions, and they succeeded. Most unions here are now national. Their own union joined what was then CAW, Canadian Auto Workers, after it went independent in the 1980s. Perrant was also a key player in the founding of the National Action Committee on the Status of Women. She championed the cause of Indigenous and immigrant women and was an early fighter for pay equity as well. She retired from the union movement in 1983, but maintained her activism. She marched when she was in her 80s with 60,000 protesters against the FTAA in the 2001 Quebec Summit, and was a vehement critic of the U.S. involvement in Iraq. She died in Montreal in 2012 at the age of 93. So another couple of buildings just to note, right down the street on the left-hand side is the very tall building. It's the Balfour Building. This was one of the first, it's 119 Spadina. It was designed by Benjamin Brown, who was an architect who, after, you guys have heard of the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire in New York City? So after that fire, Brown was designing this new factory, and it was the first one in Canada to have a sprinkler system included in the original design. So it was also the site of a dressmaker strike in 1931. So those are just across the street in 96 Spadina, there was the site of the 1934 general strike of dressmakers. So all along Spadina, this history remains with us. And you can even see it just on some of the public art that's further south along the streetcar line. There are some images that were taken from the Toronto archives with some of the images from those strikes. So, you know, look way up when you're on the streetcar there. So this will conclude our talk today, and we've only been able to give you a glimpse of some of the history that's along this street, but there was a dramatic history of women's and labor militancy, not just activism, but militant activism. And this is a kind of archaeology for us, where we're trying to scratch below the surface of the history of Toronto that we normally hear. This reveals and affirms our historical determination to achieve social and legal equality across Canada, for working men and women, for immigrants, for refugees and racialized groups, and for LGBTIQ2S communities. We've witnessed the hardships borne by working women over the past centuries, as well as their struggles to overcome them. And hopefully you've also seen some of the seeds of what became our social services. Up and down Spadina and in the side streets all along the way here were early union offices and mutual benefit societies, where the communities that were marginalized by the mainstream and by capitalists banded together to fund and provide education, recreation, healthcare, childcare, old age homes, etc. For their members. We've also seen how artists and cultural workers work together with labor in order to promote and advocate around international and local struggles. So we hope that this glimpse into our past helps you see what we have in common with these workers, and a sense of global as well as local hope for justice and equality. It's a heritage that we in our group cherish, and we want to make it not only visible, but to protect what these women have gained for us and to extend it going forward. So thank you for your time today.